Beneath the indifferent dark of the North Atlantic, where pressure presses silence into a new grammar and light becomes a thin, anxious visitor, the wreck of the RMS Titanic keeps a cache of human detritus the sea has been unwilling to release. Among hull plates, torn decor, and scattered crockery, there are shoes, dozens, perhaps hundreds, each a small testament to a step that was left unfinished. They lie in corners, in collapsed corridors, and along stairwells in configurations that are at once intimate and mysterious, as if the ship has managed to keep private a handful of personal gestures, even as it surrenders the larger frame of its story. The expedition that sparked renewed attention to these artifacts was organized less as a spectacle than as a forensic mapping. A coalition of maritime archaeologists, textile conservators, and engineers partnered with a heritage museum to create a high-resolution, three-dimensional survey of the lower decks. The mission's charter insisted on restraint, no grabbing, for souvenirs, exhaustive documentation before any intervention, and continual consultation with descendant communities where possible. Remotely operated vehicles descended like lanterns on strings, their cameras cutting pale cones through blackness, while pilots adjusted feeds in a choreography designed to minimize sediment plumes and preserve fragile micro-contexts. Shoes are ordinary, but they also encode lives. A sturdy hobnailed boot suggests laborious routines on wet docks. A polished pump speaks to evening dress and ritual. A child's small shoe, collapsed and softened, compresses a world of play and dependence into a fragile shape. In the absence of bodies, these items carry the weight of personal practice. For archaeologists, wear patterns yield information about gait and occupation. Stitch patterns and repair marks suggest socioeconomic networks of care and thrift. A scuffed toe can speak to hurried movement. A well-mended sole can speak to sentimental attachment. The initial readings provoked both methodical curiosity and a subdued awe. One cluster, found in a shadowed corridor near what researchers identified as third-class quarters, contained a neat row of small shoes, arranged as if left by an invisible line of parents, hushing children into a narrow passage. A second cluster on the promenade deck included larger shoes, some with clipped soles that suggested hurried alteration. The ROV pilots adjusted camera distances to capture stereoscopic frames for photogrammetry, while conservators annotated visible threads and pigments. Each new angle sometimes produced the unsettling sensation that the ship continued to arrange its own archive. Scientific debate followed. Some scientists proposed that hydrodynamic sorting during the sinking could corral smaller objects into eddies and pockets, producing the apparent order. Others argued that human movement during the evacuation might have clustered belongings as passengers carried, dropped, or tried to secure valued items while the ship listed and filled. The answer, as often, was complex, a mixture of human agency and physical process. The research team's approach, combining 3D mapping, sediment analysis, and contextual archival research, allowed them to model scenarios rather than default to a single explanation. This methodological pluralism became itself a subject of discourse within the field. The emotional tenor of the dives often punctured technical jargon. Pilots will describe a sudden hush over the communications channel when a camera reveals a child's leather shoe cradled by a bent stair tread. Radio voices, previously brisk with commands and coordinates, momentarily thin into silence. These are not theatrical moments engineered by the filmmakers. They are human responses to encountering objects that inhabit the last gestures of a life. To respond professionally, teams formalized an ethical code. Avoid dramatic framing, do not sensationalize, and treat imagery as evidence rather than entertainment. The code extended to the choice of music in documentaries and to the captions that would accompany public releases of images. Conservation presented a thorny calculus. Leather submerged for a century is fragile. Collagen fibers break down. Tannins wash out. And microbial mats can both protect and consume organic materials. Retrieval is an act of both rescue and responsibility. Bring an object to a lab, and it may survive under controlled treatment, but you also remove it from the matrix that gives it meaning. The conservators proposed a phased plan, extensive in situ documentation, periodic monitoring to assess active degradation, and the development of stabilization protocols before any physical recovery. Laboratories rehearsed desalination sequences, explored freeze-drying methods, and debated the trade-offs inherent in each intervention. Public reaction was immediate and multifaceted. For some, images of solitary shoes evoked haunting metaphors, the lost footprints of the sea. For others, photographs directed attention to the social history of Titanic's passengers. The distribution of shoe styles between first-class promenades and third-class corridors became a lens on class and mobility in early 20th century transatlantic travel. Families reached out with sepia photographs and trunk inventories, hoping to match a find with a remembered pair. One descendant sent a yellowed postcard showing a boy with stubby boots. The resemblance was ambiguous, but the act of sending a photograph underscored a larger truth. Objects catalyze longing and give private histories anchors. Researchers discovered that shoes could yield surprising scientific data. Microscopic particles trapped in seams preserved traces of fabrics and pollutants, and pollen grains identified by palynologists suggested seasonal cargoes and port origins. Soil and soot residues hinted at movement within heated rooms versus exterior decks. Even repair marks carried stories of economy. Who could afford new shoes and who mended boots with thread and intent? These micro-evidences allowed historians to reconstruct small ecologies of life on board and to ask larger questions about migration, work, and domestic practice within the ship's stratified spaces. Ethics drove policy. The team convened an advisory panel that included maritime archaeologists, conservators, ethicists, and representatives from communities of dissent. The panel recommended a transparent protocol, no recovery without clear conservation pathways, active outreach before any action, and educational materials that contextualize the finds within larger narratives of class, migration, and maritime. Technology. The language chosen emphasized humility. Objects are not trophies. They are traces that deserve careful interpretation and respect.